So very much like this room, gentlemen tend to be slightly overrepresented. There's a mix of ages. People of all sorts of ages are starting up businesses. Those people of an international background, born overseas, tend to be slightly older when they're starting up their business. They also, people who are starting up businesses tend to be fairly well endowed in Australia with education. So those people who engage in business startup, quite a few of those have already completed university degrees. And over half of the sample that we found who were starting up a new business had already done so previously before. So there's prior experience in this type of thing. When it comes to the people that join together to do this, lots of people do it in teams. So, but those teams aren't necessarily the sort of teams that you would see in any management textbook, teams that are put together from people with the right sort of skills, the right sort of stuff. In this random sample of businesses from Australia, those teams tend to be familial teams, started up with your partner and the like. And these modest type of firms can be across all range of industries, quite often entering into industries with low barriers to entry, so lots of retail types of businesses, lots of firms operating in service industries. And the types of firms that they start up tend to be independent types of businesses rather than franchises, or there's seem to be quite low levels of corporate entrepreneurship. But if you compare this type of sample with a sister study in the US, you can see that the Australian firms tend to hold up relatively well compared to the US counterparts. So there are Australian firms tend to be focused more on following an opportunity than they are being forced into entrepreneurship out of necessity. And as I mentioned about prior experience and education, these tend to be well represented in the Australian study as well. So here's a short breakdown on gender. You can see that those female founders are slightly underrepresented compared to male founders. And what happens to these firms? So if we compare our two types of samples, we have those people who have already started a business, those are young firms, and those people who are in the process of starting a firm, those nascent firms. The nascent firms tend to break down after 3 or 4 years into groups of 3. So 1/3 of those founders are successful in starting up a business that is trading in the market, making money. 1/3 of those firms have given up their startup attempt, and another 1/3 of those firms are somewhere in the nether regions of not quite giving up and not quite succeeding. And we also find that the young firms in our sample are quite robust to termination. So that is, those firms, those young firms, seem to be able to hang around. As I mentioned, this random sample is relatively modest in type, so the firms tend to have low levels of aspiration, start in industries like retail and the like. And if the firms, those people who exit their firm, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing, right? So there tends to be a conflation of quitting your venture and calling that a failure, but that's not necessarily the case. So what we found is that there's quite low levels of financial loss, and that's quite often confined to the founders. But even those people who exited their firms saw it as a positive thing and would be keen to involve themselves in entrepreneurship again. Okay, so that graph on your top left there shows that split between the nascent and young firms. So starting a business over 4 years breaks down into thirds between those who get up and running, those who exit their attempt, and those that are somewhere in between. Whereas the young firms, the vast majority of those are still around after 4 years. We find that some industries are harder to start your firms up than others, or different types of firms are harder to start, for instance. So if you break things down by whether it's a product-based firm or a service-based firm, it seems to be that service-based firms are easier to get up and running than product-based firms. And we know that young firms are those firms that create jobs. When it comes to the level of innovation within any of these early stage firms, the simple story is that almost all of these firms are doing something that is new. But just how new is the question? We asked the founders about their level of innovation, and we asked them repeatedly over the waves of our study. And what we find almost invariably is that at the start of their process, the start of their journey, they seem to overestimate their level of novelty compared to other firms that are trading. And then slowly over time, as the years go by, they tend to become aware that they're not, the special snowflakes that they thought they were at the very start. They don't have that great level of innovation, and they learn this over time. But that said, a sizable minority of firms do engage in protecting their IP. They do engage in some level of innovation. They do have some sort of R&D focus. And there's some industry differences between those firms that possess that or not. Innovation tends to be low in the construction industries and high in manufacturing industries. What else? Yeah, I think I've already talked there about the adaptation of the ventures to their acknowledgement of their novelty. That tends to be adjusted down over time. And particularly when it comes to the nascent firms. So those firms that are at the earliest stage before they've started trading in the market tend to get the greatest shock in terms of what it's really like, what their venture is really like compared to those out there in the market. And so they revise down their estimates of innovation quite more markedly than those already trading in the market who have some level of reality about where they're placed. In terms of how Australian firms internationalise, there's some encouraging results for Australia, that there are relatively decent levels of internationalisation. About 1/5 of all of those firms, either nascent or young, engage somehow in international markets, whether they're trading internationally or importing and the like. That's especially the case in our high potential sample, and that's not surprising, I guess. Those firms have a high level of ambition, and so would like to see their products and services engaged across a wide geographic range. Those founders that already have some sort of international experience and background tend to capitalise that when it comes to their internationalisation activities in their firms. And so those who have prior experience overseas, have worked overseas, they are firms that are more likely to do so in their businesses. I can see there up on that top left there's a comparison between the nascent and young firms, and you'll see that over time the level of internationalisation, international sales, the percentage of those that make international sales stays relatively similar. So this sort of gives weight to those that internationalise tend to do so from an early stage. And we also see in the bottom right there the comparison between high potential firms and our random sample of firms, and we see that those with higher ambition have a far broader scope in their internationalisation activities, and so have a larger level of sales made overseas. Oops, I've done it again. Just to explore those growth and high potential firms a little bit more deeply, it's not so surprising that firms with high levels of ambition tend to be trying to capitalise on their background, their more extensive experience, their higher levels of ambition, their high levels of innovation in the firms. And these, if anything, are more like the textbook firms that you would hear about, where the teams aren't those familial-based teams, not spouse-based teams, but teams that are put together for the purpose of starting up a business. And on all accounts, they tend to perform relatively well. They're more likely to survive, they're more likely to employ people, they're more likely, if nascent firms, to become operational. They're more likely to internationalise, as we've seen. But with that, there's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? So while they can reap some greater benefit, they also have the potential to have greater downside if their firm does not catch on. So we can see that in that bottom right graph there, where you see a comparison between a regular random sample firm in terms of their level of profit or loss. So the loss is the sort of below that zero line, the profit is above that zero line. There's a far smaller range of profit and loss made by the random sample firms compared with our high potential firms, who tend to win bigger, but they also might lose bigger. We can also see that when we're talking about losses, that it's important that you know just when to quit, not throwing good money after bad. Those firms that stay in the process perhaps longer than they should tend to make greater losses. Okay, from here on in, now that we've got a bit of a picture of what firms look like, what their outcomes look like, what type of aspects go to make up those firms that are starting businesses in Australia, now we can turn to what they actually do and what they achieve from the things that they do. And Per later on in the discussion will dig a bit more deeply into some of these aspects, but just to cover them quickly in those things that we covered in the reports there. Things like planning, right? So business planning is quite often the thing that's taught. If you're going to learn how to do a startup, if you go to any education about businesses, invariably you'll get taught about business planning. Those businesses that are actually using business planning tend to use it as a thinking tool. And that's probably a good thing, right? They use it to think through what they're doing with their business. It tends to be those that are in the startup process, the nascent firms, that are more likely to engage in this planning process than those young firms that have already engaged. So I don't know exactly what to take from that, but maybe it's more that those starting up are thinking about it, whereas those that are already engaged in entrepreneurship, trading in the market and the like, are too busy getting on with the game. When it comes to the process and how long it takes to start a business, there's really no answer to that. There are all ranges of times. It can take from a month to quite a number of years, and we've got all sorts of ventures like that in our study. Some people, and you can see that in those firms that still after 5 or 6 years where we've been tracking them, they still haven't got their business up and running, but they still haven't decided to quit, right? So they're still in the process of starting up. What seems to be the case more and more, though, is that what you do during the startup process is important. And that's, I guess, a relatively good thing to hear. So it is in your power when starting the business to actually achieve the aims that you aim for through your actions. One thing to take from this is Australian businesses tend to be self-funded more than not. About 3/4 of the businesses didn't even bother to go and try and find funds from other sources. So that's only 1/4 of businesses were looking for external funding. But those who ask tended to receive funding. So this might lead to the conclusion that startup business, early stage businesses have to engage in more resourceful behaviours, and Per will explore that a little bit later. As I mentioned, those who are prospective startups are the ones that are planning more likely, compared to those that are already in the game and working hard on their businesses. They're too busy doing things. And then I'll leave it to Per to unpack that sort of sequence stuff a little bit later. Okay, so maybe this is the reason that many of you are here for. You know, what are the things that work, right? What leads to success in starting up a business? But the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, you know, is what defines success? How do we gauge that? What does it mean to be a successful new business? Well, to answer that, we come up with a bunch of different ways. Potential measures of success. So it may be that just hanging around surviving is one thing. Employing people might be a measure of success. What you think about how your venture is placed might be a level of success to you. Okay, so we analysed our data with a lot of these different success factors, and they tend to have different drivers, right? So mere survival, being able to hang around, tends to be a trade-off between the resources that you apply to the venture compared to the aspirations that you have for the venture. So I guess the takeaway from this is that you need to be realistic with your startup, but you also need to hang in there, right? So you also need to be tenacious. What we found from the Causey data is that employing people is largely driven by the type of firm that they start up. While employment grows over time across many of the firms, the firm type tends to be that drives employment more than anything. An interesting one is the comparison between what you perceive as performance in the venture versus the reality of what you achieve, right? So we asked those in our study how they thought they were performing. And we can see there that what drives their answer to that question is their ambitions for the venture, right? So this perception of performance is driven down by having too strong an ambition for the venture and potentially not reaching that level of performance. But it's enhanced, it's increased by actually engaging and working hard in your business. Yeah? What happens after the firm exit? So we asked those people who left their firms, how did they feel about their experience? And it's an interesting fact that those that were in the nascent sample, so those during the startup phase after their businesses, tended to go back to the types of jobs that they had prior to starting up, whereas those that were in the young firm sample who had already started a business tend to use that as a reason to go on to new and different activities, be it employment or starting up a new business. So in some respects, positive experiences of entrepreneurship, of terminated entrepreneurship, so exiting your business is potentially driven by what comes after, whereas negative experiences can be driven by what you experience during your startup process. Okay, I think that's about all for me, Per.
So I'm trying now to summarize 4 doctoral dissertations in 15 minutes. So that's about 10, 12 years of hard work, 800 pages of text. So I will speak fast. But I can't do full justice to all of this work, of course. 2 things about, especially the random samples, that we should have established more firmly as we started. Firstly, any random sample of businesses is dominated by a modest majority. So among those startups, you have a majority that is essentially self-employment, or they start very small and they remain small, sometimes even part-time businesses. The other thing is that a random sample is a very heterogeneous sample, a very diverse sample. So we have different types of people starting very different types of businesses for different types of reasons, and they do this at different pace, and they are at different stages of the startup process when we first capture them. So that is quite a challenge for research to sort of arrive at any strong generalizations when you have so much diversity along different dimensions. But that is what those doctoral students, now doctors, have tried to do. So the first doctoral dissertation that was completed was by Seme. He's from Sri Lanka, and he looked at novelty and relatedness. So novelty is sort of essentially innovation along different dimensions. How much newness or novelty does this venture bring? And relatedness is how closely is the venture idea to the resources and knowledge that you already possessed. So novelty or innovation can be a good thing if you pull it off. It increases your probability of making it big if you're successful. But we actually suspect that it makes it more difficult to get a business up and running in the first place, because there are more hurdles to pass and so forth. But that negative relationship may be hidden by a positive indirect relationship. Those that are onto something more novel may be willing to invest more time and money into it because they think that this will pay off, and more time and money should make it more likely that they have a positive outcome. Relatedness, we think, should have a positive main effect. It's easier to start a business that is closely aligned with what you already know and the resources you have. But if you already have a lot of the resources, you're probably going to invest less. So that is an indirect negative effect there. And we also suspected that relatedness would decrease this problem of novelty, that it would be easier to pull off starting something novel if it is close to your resources and knowledge. And by and large, Seme found support for those relationships. We didn't find that last thing, so that exited the picture. So the takeaway would be, for an easier journey, choose a venture idea closely aligned with your current resources. More resources than knowledge, actually. According to these results. And be prepared to compensate for the negative effect of novelty by putting in more hours. It was more about hours than putting in more money, according to the results. We should caution, though, that when Seme did this, we only had 2 waves of data. We know we have this exaggerated self-perception of novelty and so forth. So we should look at this again more deeply. But that is our tentative conclusions about those issues. Then we have Christophe, French guy, now in Lille in France. He looks at the role of business planning. Of course, business planning is a popular topic, and anything about entrepreneurship and startups. And he looks at whether they do plan or not, existence, whether if they have a plan, whether it is an informal plan or a formally written plan, and he looks at whether they revise the plan over time. And if some people would think it's obvious that planning would be a good thing, but there are actually 2 lines of argumentation, and previous results are do not point clearly in favor of either. So one argument is that planning makes you more focused, it drives effort, and therefore you're more likely to be successful in founding a firm. But the planning exercise may also put blinkers on you. So you build your fantasy world and you become less open to new information, and you lock in your ideas and become less flexible. And because of this lesser flexibility, you would actually have a negative effect on the ability to get a new business up and running. And then we also expected experience and type of venture to influence this. So it should matter whether you have a lot of prior experience or not, whether you're inclined to plan and what the benefits of planning would be, and it should matter whether it is a Me Too business startup or a very novel startup, was the logic. So what we find is that we can't really say that, generally speaking, those that plan do better than those that don't plan. It is a relatively neutral relationship there. But if you plan, you should have a formally written plan. You should do it for real. And the strongest result, perhaps, was that revision of the plan, which also has to do with flexibility, is something that should be encouraged. So if you plan, make it a live document. We didn't find that these relationships vary by experience or vary by level of innovation, which was surprising. We did not find support for the argument that you become less flexible because you plan. On the other hand, we didn't find that flexibility, as we measured it, drove outcomes either. But the takeaway would be, if you choose to plan, take it seriously, develop a formally written plan, and revise it regularly. I should make sure I have any idea of where I am on time. Christoph also looked at a lot of descriptive information about business planning. The use of planning, the proportion of ventures that doesn't have a plan actually increases over time. And that this seems to be at odds with what Scott just said. I think Scott has calculated cumulatively the proportion that ever reported doing planning, and that sort of increases over time. But over time, there is less planning, and the young firms plan less than the nascent firms do. And this is a bit ironic, because there's also the argument that early on you may not be able to plan because there's so much uncertainty, so many moving parts, it doesn't make much sense to plan. When things are more set, then things are plannable. So it seems to be the case that the founders use it less when it would make more sense to use it. Maybe they get a bit disenchanted with it early on and therefore go in the wrong direction there. The importance of various types of uses of a plan all decrease over time. But there's some constants there. The most important reported use is as an analytical tool, just as a means of making sure that you have thought through important things. And the least important use is as a means to obtain funding, because as Scott reported, a large proportion of them don't ask for external funding. Then we have Julienne. She isn't quite finished yet, but she looks at bricolage and innovation and outcomes. And what is bricolage? Entrepreneurial bricolage is a research code for the creatively frugal ways in which entrepreneurs sometimes seem to manage to create significant something out of seemingly nothing. So you get a lot done with minimal resources, right? And there are three parts to this: making do. Making do is that you aim for workable solutions with the meager means you have, rather than giving up and doing nothing, or rather than trying to reach the perfect solution that isn't attainable anyway. To use resources at hand, use what you have or what you can obtain very cheaply, rather than trying to get the perfect resources, brand new, but also costly. Right? And resource combination for new purposes. So this is combining resources in new ways, using resources for other purposes than they were originally meant to be used for, and seeing things as resources that others don't even see have any value. So bricolage, you can say that this is the normal way of life in developing countries. You have palm trees, bamboo, banana tree, and used rice bags, and that is your food, your house, your furniture, your toys, your musical instruments, and your clothes and your entertainment. Right? But you can also exemplify bricolage with the famous rescue operation of Apollo 13 after they had this very serious accident on board. And with the very limited things they had at hand, they had to come up with ad hoc solutions of solving this problem. So, Julien relates bricolage to innovation. It is not necessarily the case that just because you do more of this that you end up being more innovative. You may have to be creative in your attempts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have an innovative output. And performance in terms of, for the nascent firms, getting up and running, and in terms of the young firms, the level of sales that you reach. So, and she's also looking at how the composition of the team and what kind of environment, which varies by industries, how that influences this relationship. And I'm not going, since this is still work in progress, I'm not going to go into any great detail on those results, but I can say that overall, the effect of engaging in this kind of activity seems to be positive. Those that do more bricolage have more innovation. Those that engage in more bricolage are less likely to terminate their startup efforts. Those that engage in more bricolage have, on average, slightly higher sales than their other businesses. So those that sort of see that this is what I'm doing, they can relax and not feel that what they're doing is wrong or unprofessional. It is not wrong or unprofessional to apply these frugal tactics at early stages of venture development. It may be the right thing to do. But based on some aspects of Julien's work, as well as other research and pure logic, there's also reason to caution against doing too much of it, right? And to make it your religion, that you should always do it on the cheap and so forth. And especially later in your development, you may want to do this back office rather than in the open where your stakeholders can see all your ad hoc solutions. And then I also have to summarize Scott's thesis because he knows too much. So there's no way that he can summarize his own work in 2-3 minutes, right? So one thing we're looking at in this research is what's called gestation activities. This is all those, and this is about the nascent businesses now. All those various things that you might do on the road to getting a business up and running. That's what we call gestation activities. We have in excess of 30, maybe 40 of these. And we ask about whether they've done it and when they have done it. And when researchers have tried to do this before, what they find is very messy. The ordering of those actions can follow absolutely any order, including having sales as the very first thing that happens. And then the rest follows. So it's very messy, and we just get confused on a higher level when we try to operate on that level. So what Scott did was quite a smart thing, was to try and look at this at a little bit more aggregate level. So and one way of doing that is to not care about exactly what they do at different points in time, but how much they do and how the level of activity pans out over time. And the other approach he had was to not look at the single actions, but to classify those actions as pertaining to discovery and exploitation, respectively. And their discovery has to do with developing your business concept and elaborating on your business concept. And exploitation is about taking concrete actions to making it happen, obtaining resources, convincing customers that they should buy those products. So when it comes to action rate and action timing, the first category there, to get a nascent venture up and running, it is preferable to have a higher rate of activity rather than a lower rate of activity, and to have an increasing rather than a decreasing activity rate over time. So start at a relatively high level of activity to gain momentum, and then to accelerate. I should say here that this is relative to other businesses. It is not a very frantic level of activity we're talking about in most cases here, but relative to the average for those investigated businesses. So a low level of activity, even over time, that is not the optimal way of trying to do it. Starting optimistically with a flurry activities and then running out of steam and having less and less activity over time isn't what's going to get you there either. It's rather something like this. Start at a reasonably high level and then increase the level of activity over time. That is, on average, going to be more successful in getting this venture up and running in the end. And then Scott did something really creative and bringing in sequencing methodology that they use in genetics and so forth. So he looked at how does the emphasis on discovery versus exploitation pan out over time. And there are three categories of the three possibilities here. Green is discovery, should we call it orange, is exploitation, and the mauve, purple there is simultaneously engaging in both discovery and exploitation type activities. So what Scott did, he compared actual sequences to 5, out of which you see 2, theoretically defined prototype sequences. The first one there being, do all the conceptual development first, and then you have sort of everything set, and then you launch it, and it's all exploitation after that. And the other one, the other extreme there is that you always mix this over time, discovery, exploitation mixed over time. Then he compared with random sequences as well, 5 of those. And there is no logical order at all there, right? They're random. And then the question is, what are the winning sequences here? Well, luckily, those that resemble random sequences are not those that do the best. They do worse than the average. So there's some order to this. And that was a relief compared to the earlier research that didn't really find any way of making sense of the sequence. The textbook way of sort of all the conceptual development first and then the ground launch and all exploitation, those that are similar to that are not the most successful either. And neither are those that sort of play with discovery exploitation in equal measure throughout the process. So the winning sequences look more like this. And the right one is uneven because that's an actual empirical sequence. It also has sort of the amount of activity over time and not just the type of activity. So a little bit of pure discovery first, concentrating on the idea. But relatively early into mixed mode. So start doing actual attempts to exploit while still playing with the idea, right? Don't end that too early. And if you see the empirical prototypical sequence to the right, this goes on for quite a long time before you enter the stage of pure exploitation, and you don't have to care too much about the last mauve items there because we have very few cases that go on for that number of activities. So the takeaway would be that, okay, some early pure concept development, but move relatively early into concrete actions towards making it happen. But don't stop playing with the idea too early either. It will need some changing in response to what you learn from the interaction with the market and suppliers and so forth. At some point, make your mind up, stop playing and say, this is largely it now. So this is what I believe, and this is what we're really going to run with. Okay, so that was what I had in my presentation. Like I said in the beginning, you can Google ACE QUT and find us there. If you want our newsletter and invitation to things like this, you can email Karen or myself. And we have a Twitter hashtag. Shouldn't there be
No, that's us.
Yeah,
That's our hand.
yeah, should be a hashtag. Not my area of expertise, but Scott should have introduced that. He failed to. So we, despite having summarized so many reports and so many dissertations in this presentation, we actually have some 10 minutes for Q&A. Yes?
I was wondering about the 1,000 businesses that were sampled, whether it was a wide range of different industries or any particular areas.
The random samples were all industries. There was no pre-stratification at all. We contacted people, and if they were involved in a business startup, it was in the sample, and regardless of industries. It's across all industries. In the high potential oversample, it's a narrower set of industries because you find a higher potential in more high-tech areas and so forth. Yes?
How much variation did you find in the sequences going to be successful?
Even at this much more aggregated level, I think you found like 12 or 13 that had more than one occurrence with exactly the same sequence.
So of the 625 firms that did stuff over time, if you pick 2 categories to categorise things into what they do, which I did, and you compared their order in which they did things, then of the 625, a small handful did things the same way. And those, on the most part, were fairly trivial ones who'd only done a few things. So even with that 2 categories, it's very, very complex, right? So, people doing all sorts of things in all sorts of orders.
But that is if you demand it to be exactly the same. I mean, you can say this. Would you have an estimate of what proportion followed anything like what we singled out as the more advantageous?
Yeah, so those sort of prototype empirical sequences, groups of 6 or 7 clusters of things that we tested against, their outcomes.
Yeah, but what proportion? If we say your empirical clusters 4 and 5, which were the most?
Yeah, so there would be, maybe 20% in some of those, And they're more or less like that type of sequence, right? So of those, some might be exactly the same as that, but others are less like.
Yes, Richard.
Scott, during you identified control for industry structure analysis. And was there any clear sort of pattern? Like, for example, ICT. Not just ICT, but some aspects of ICT. Very quick market experimentation and feedback and then qualify. Were there any other industries where that was sort of predominant?
Yeah, this is where it starts to, with our sample, even 625 sounds like a lot of firms, right? But when you get to analysing those subsamples of, we had 17 industries broken down, and so you get smaller and smaller sets, and it's harder to draw generalisations between them. So I'm working with a colleague over the summer where we're going to pool the US, 2 US data sets and ours, and hopefully we'll start to get, bigger sets of data where we can analyse those sort of relationships. But that was something that I looked for, Richard. You kind of hope that, types of industries do things in, similar ways, right? That would make sense. But yeah, those associations weren't clear in the data. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm just wondering what the policy implications are for this type of research. Is this something the government should be supporting, and if so, how? Or incubators, or?
Should be supporting it in smart ways. I think what I was talking about towards the end here, at a relatively detailed level, that is not really government policy kind of stuff. The portrayal we make of the empirical reality of business startups, I think, is very useful for policy, because And this has developed over time. When I first had policy interactions like 20, 30 years ago, there was much more of this mental model that all businesses start with out of sort of economic rationality. They are growth oriented. It is finance that is holding them back more than anything else, and so forth, right? So just like as academics have learned over time what the phenomenon really looks like, so have policymakers, and that will lead to more policies that are better aligned with empirical realities. Yes?
Any work done around looking at large injection of funds at any point in time for growth, like typical startup fashion with
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think we even got anyone in our sample of even in the high potential sample who got angel or VC funding. Was it?
Oh, we did. I think in the random sample it was all of one.
Right.
One nascent firms and one young firm, something of that order. I mean, that's how rare it is that startups have formal venture capital. Angels was a little bit more, but I mean, still very, very low numbers. So in a random sample, you hardly even capture that phenomenon. We would have more of it in the high potential sample. We haven't really analyzed that systematically, so that I can on the basis of this research give any really informed answers to. Yes?
Just on that point, so when firms decide to go international or they try internationalising, find any causation to actually find external funding to enable that?
We have not made that link, and I don't think we would find it. Again, possibly in the high potential oversample, if we looked at it in more detail. Then again, that is a small group, and we may not find it. The clearest pattern of internationalization is that those that have any kind of international dealings, they have so from very early on. And that is basically before there is any significant money to put it in. And one of the reasons for this is that we have, it's a migration country, right? So we have lots and lots of people who have international background in their family. So I think that accounts for a high share of that. Should say in that context that people with immigrant background are neither overrepresented nor underrepresented among the business founders. It's about 25% of them are born elsewhere, and about 50% of them are either themselves or at least one parent has a foreign background.
But they are overrepresented in those that internationalise, right? So.
No, yeah, they are overrepresented.
So people who have, immigrant parents tend to internationalise.
Mm.